Whew, it's getting a little hot over in France right now. If you haven't followed the news, France is on fire, and we all saw this coming. Ladies and gentlemen, I am Dan Weichart of Weichart Media. Thank you again for joining with me. If you haven't seen it already, France is on fire. Unfortunately, after the slaying, definitely a questionable slaying of a young Arab boy who was apparently joyriding in a vehicle at like 8 o'clock or so in the morning. This individual was pulled over, or attempted to be pulled over, by police. This individual resisted and was shot by cops. As a result of that, the Arab population that exists in France revolted, for lack of a better word. The mother was noted as having said, revolt for my son, a bunch of calls for violence, calls for rioting, and now we see what is essentially a civil war breaking out into France, but probably more accurately stated as an ethnic uprising. And we'll get into what I mean by that. So, as a brief background for maybe those of you who did not know, France actually has an incredibly large number of Arabic Muslims living in France proper. And the reason for this is in 1964, some decades ago, France used to have control over Algeria, which is a state on the northern coast of Africa, bordering the Mediterranean, part of what's called the Maghreb, almost entirely Islamic area. France owned Algiers as a colony for the longest time. As you can imagine, as is the case with a lot of colonies, the native Muslim population did not like French oversight. And this is kind of the point of this discussion today. The two societies were not interoperable. The Muslim way of life in North Africa was and has been incompatible with French society, which is inherently a Western country having its origins in the Western moral tradition. And just for those of you who may have missed this piece, when I say Western moral tradition, the Western moral tradition can be summed up as a combination of Greek, read Athenian, philosophy, Roman civil order, and the spiritual revelation of Jerusalem, specifically Judeo-Christian Jerusalem. When you think about the Western moral tradition, you should think of a society which is defined by a Judeo-Christian moral foundation, conducted in the format of Roman civil order, or this idea of being a nation of laws. That's a Roman thing. Further building out that sort of reason and backbone is Greek reason. So if were in high school or college and you read any Socrates, Aristotle, Plato, and any of the other philosophers that came out of that realm, they were all born, or that school of thought was born in Athens. So a combination of those three thought processes bring to us today what is the Western moral tradition. And the Western moral tradition is fundamentally incompatible with a couple of other different cultural elements in the world. In the case of France, that different cultural element is the Middle Eastern, mostly Arabic, mostly Muslim way of living or way of life. It's not necessarily denigrating to those individuals. It's just incompatible. The two ideas are anathema to each other. Having the Western moral tradition and the Middle Eastern way of life coexisting is equivalent to cognitive dissonance in one's own mind, trying to hold two contradictory thoughts at the same time, or contradictory opinions at the same time. It's not possible. Even in the West, when you think, oh, well, Dan, look, there are plenty of Muslim people within the West. And that's true. However, I think you'll quite notice, if you know anything about it, the individuals who form up Muslim communities in the West tend to form what are known as enclaves, or can be called enclaves, which are neighborhoods, in some cases whole cities, which are uniquely controlled almost entirely by fellow Muslims. They create their own societies within a broader society. The idea of assimilation, intermingling, generally does not happen, is widely frowned upon. And it's widely frowned upon from the Muslim side. For good or for bad, they value their belief system above all else. For example, most Westerners would not have a problem, at least unless they knew, intermarrying with an individual who is a Muslim or of Arabic descent. Really, the Arabic descent doesn't matter nearly as much as the belief structure. Would not have a problem with that. The reverse would be the case, especially if an individual who was themselves Muslim entered into a relationship with a non-Muslim, or tried to intermarry with a non-Muslim with no intent to convert, or no stipulation upon conversion. It's just not a thing that goes. So France used to have control over Algeria up until 1962-64, when racial tension got so high between the native Muslims and the occupying French, or the colonial French. And there's also actual Franks, like French people who were living in Algeria at the time as part of an immigration from France to help intermingle the population. So there's a huge thing known as the Algerian War. The French themselves conducted a great deal of human rights violations in response to this. Now, to be fair, there were also a great number of human rights violations on the native Muslim side as well. So both did bad things, we'll say it that way. But as a fallout to that, what France decided to do was to, rather than simply leave the Algerians alone, disconnect politically and say, hey, look, Algeria, okay, you want your independence, you're on your own, bye, we're going back to France. They instead decided to offer French citizenship to all Algerians who wanted it. And with French citizenship, of course, came the opportunity for Algerians to move to France proper and have that. Now, at the time, many of them chose to stay, but especially in the last few decades, many Muslims from Algeria have decided to move to France in search of a better economic future, and, as I have stated, have formed their own neighborhoods and enclaves within France, which are largely no-go zones for non-Muslims or non-Algerians living in France. So, a lot of tension going on there. And so this is the latest outgrowth of that. Now, the interesting thing about the current outgrowth of violence in France is that it's not merely religion-based, although the religion of the individuals is certainly in question. If you pull up any videos on Twitter, listening to the person's rioting, talking, they're making heavy references to the Quran and so forth. So it is certainly religiously motivated, but there's also a racial component involved. Because as it does with all things, unfortunately, American leftism has infected France as much as it has any other place on planet Earth. And so you'll often hear the native Arabs talking about a systemically racist French police force cracking down unnecessarily on Arabs living in France. There's probably there might be some validity to that. And if there's ever any instance of racial profiling or actual racism, I'm pretty sure France holds the same position as most Western countries. Point these individuals out, and we will duly prosecute. So an appropriate response will be rendered. However, that is widely regarded as insufficient and irrelevant, really, because when you are dealing with, unfortunately, again, American leftism, as it infects things, logic doesn't really matter, because deception and two-facedness is not a bug of leftism. It is a feature. It is a mechanism to achieve power. And again, as another aside, that is something that I would attempt to communicate to you guys. So that is what's breaking down now. If you haven't seen it, as I'm talking, I'll see if I can throw up some shots and images from various news sources. France is on fire. Riots, cars burnt out. You're also seeing instances where individuals are walking around with fully automatic weapons, belt-fed machine guns and things like that. Rioters are. As another aside, this is a live action case for the Second Amendment, pretty much anywhere on planet Earth, but I digress again. You've seen people firing RPGs, all kinds of craziness going on. So, needless to say, it's quite the mess. To be fair, the French are also kind of stepping in it themselves. The French state, the French people don't deserve this, but the French state has certainly created this problem for itself. Firstly, in the original stupid argument that they should offer Algerians French citizenship, under the false, unfortunately, liberal belief that the roots of different societies are mostly interchangeable or interoperable. To explain, a lot of, I'll say leftists at this point, will look back on the Western moral tradition with disdain while standing upon or feeding upon the good fruits of the Western moral tradition. That's not to say that everything the West has done is perfect, not by a long shot, But there's no question that it is the West that has brought the world into modernity. It is the West that has revolutionized basically every field that you can think of. It is the West that has provided a moral framework and a form of governance which seems to be the best that we have created thus far for all mankind, which is a democratic republic. It's what America is. It's what pretty much the entirety of Europe is as well, where we elect people to represent us to government as opposed to a monarchy or some sort of religious authoritarianism. It is the West that created that. It is out of Judeo-Christian moral frameworks that has been birthed. Many aspects of our criminal justice system, which we take for granted, also birthed from the Western moral tradition. Unfortunately, those roots are not interchangeable with the Middle Eastern or Muslim ways of life. At the same time, it wasn't always the case. You can look back in history. There were points where during the Ottoman Empire, even to a certain degree, before that, there were like Constantinople, for example. These places were heights of civilization. If, for example, in the West, we talk about, if you've ever went through high school algebra, the study of the numbers, we use Arabic numerals. Well, there's a reason for that. There's a certain period in history where the Arabs made a tremendous amount of discoveries and leaps forward in the fields of mathematics and astronomy, which we still utilize to this day. So it wasn't always the case. That's a whole separate topic. But unfortunately, it seems that the Arab world abandoned its movement toward reason, movement toward a Hellenization, if you will, of the Islamic religion. Hellenization mean an application of Greek-like reason. Like they were on their way to that, but a thing happened. We'll get into that later. But they abandoned that, and so that's not unfortunately the Middle East or the Arab world or the Muslim world that we operate in or operate with today. So the two societies at present are anathema to one another. And that goes both ways. Like obviously I'm an American. I'm sitting here from a Western moral tradition, European descendant, American-born position. At the same time, if you're thinking of yourself, if you happen to have pawned this video and you're like, well, I'm a devout Muslim guy or gal, I would say, look, probably not a good idea to immigrate to a country that has beliefs that you don't agree with, right? If you're a fundamental Muslim, why would you go to a country, insert joke, if you're a fundamentally Muslim Algerian, why would you go to the country that invented the blowjob, to quote the Ballad of Ricky Bobby, Talladega Nights? It just doesn't quite track. Again, you got to be okay. You got to understand the kind of culture you're going into. And I'm joking a little bit about the Ricky Bobby reference. However, there's some truth to the idea that if you're a fundamentalist, why would you put yourself in a liberal society? It's not going to go well for you. There's going to be conflict. And the problem with that conflict, unfortunately, depending on what side you're standing on, is it will devolve into violence. So the side of that is more willing to utilize violence can take over. What we see now in France is an outgrowth of that fact. So to kind of bring it home, or to begin bringing it home, as of the 1960s, France began importing the third world into its country. And I'm sure many people in Algeria who were experiencing hard times, not doing so hot in Algeria, saw the wealth and prosperity of France at the time and decided to move there and bring a lot of the culture and beliefs that made and has kept their society in a barbaric state to this day. And if you're offended by the phrase barbaric, you shouldn't be, because it's quite literally a statement of fact, given that the term barbarian is a reference to the Berbers or Barbers, an ethnic group or collection of tribal peoples from North Africa. And the name Barber is an Arabic surname of murky origin. But some of the first rulers of Algeria from the Ottoman Empire that are by the name of Ors and Hayreddin Barbarossa. And then conversely, when you start hearing of the Barbary pirates, that's where the origin of the word barbarian comes from, or barbaric. And if you whatever the word barbaric draws to mind, it's what they did. To kind of another aside, a brief history lesson. After American independence, the British later declared slavery a no-go anymore and spent a great deal of blood and treasure fighting the Barbary pirates, who, among other things, were continuing to conduct the slave trade within British territory. Because remember, at this time, the British Empire was still pretty huge all throughout the Mediterranean and elsewhere. And so the British spent a great deal of blood and treasure to silence the Barbary pirates. Similarly, in America, if you are familiar at all with the Marine Corps, the Marine Corps' anthem, there's a line in there, and for my Marine Corps brothers, I apologize for maybe butchering the song. I'm not going to sing it, but there's a line. How does it go? From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. Tripoli is in Libya. That's a reference to the fact that one of the earliest missions of the U.S. Marine Corps, as recorded, is fighting Barbary pirates in the Mediterranean as the United States' a naval expeditionary force. So anyway, another brief aside. So if you're offended by the term barbaric, that's just sucks for you. You should learn what that means. Anyway, brief aside. So you're importing a quite literally a barbaric culture into your Western liberal democracy, and you think that's going to go just swimmingly. This is unfortunately a kind of liberal idea which attempts to secularize itself from its own Judeo-Christian roots and look at the moral tradition and the framework that the Western moral tradition was grown from, that sort of Judeo-Christian soil, and look back on that with not only disdain, but assume that those roots, like I've said previously, are interchangeable with basically any other. And so the thought of the French back in the 1960s was, hey, look, we're going to offer French citizenship. We'll bring them in. We'll show them how awesome liberalism is, how awesome it is to be part of the Western moral tradition, and it's going to go great. And then all of a sudden, we're going to have this beautiful intermingling of people, and it's going to be good, and this is going to bring about peace between France and Algeria, which is obviously completely dumb, because what they fail to account is that the Algerians have no interest in even in the 60s, liberalism, Western liberalism. They have no interest in it. So what happened, France imported a bunch of these individuals. Rather than those individuals intermingling and assimilating into French society, they instead formed enclaves of their own societies, which were essentially Algeria, but now physically located in France. Again, a barbaric culture now located in France. And we expected good things to come of that. And the tension between the two has now been building and building and building and building. And again, I'm not suggesting that the French have been perfect. Far from it in their interactions with Algeria previously. There's plenty of criticism to go around there. Nevertheless, the move should have been, okay, Algeria, you want your independence, you are independent, bye, and left. Leave them alone. Leave them alone. But instead they try this foolhardy intermingling thing. And again, enclaves were formed. Assimilation did not happen because the individuals who came to France were uninterested in assimilation. And so now you have these distinct ethnic and nationality groups, ethnic and religious groups, who are diametrically opposed to one another. Fundamentalist Muslims are not down with French society. They're just not. The French are highly liberal, libertine, I might say. Right? So everything from the social interaction and all that, the like Franks, like the actual ethnic French, and the Arabs of the area do not commingle. Now, it just so happens that the racial groups align ideologically. And just to kind of further drive home that point, presently in France, obviously you're seeing a large push for rioters which are of Arab and Muslim descent in the area rioting. There's also members of Antifa, which is typically a far leftist organization or affiliation, actually going out and doing battle, fighting with native Franks, fighting with other native Franks in defense of the Arab rioters roaming through France. Again, duplicity is not a bug of the left, it is a feature. And so when you have somebody who is, very far progressive, whom the fundamentalist Muslim would they just wouldn't like them, to put it very mildly, would be completely opposed to. These individuals will go out and fight on behalf, these leftists will go out and do battle on behalf of Arab rioters, and they would gladly kill one another. But the common enemy is your typical conservative, and I say conservative very lightly, conservative to liberal Western moral tradition, a Western society. So anyway, when you import these individuals into your country, bad things happened. Bad things happen and are happening now. We're seeing that writ large, and you're starting to see these kind of tensions build in many places of the world. Sweden's having a problem with this. London's having a problem with this. Thank God the United States presently does not have a huge amount of tension here. But the United States is also significantly larger than France or Sweden is. And we can sustain, and our problem with immigration does not have as much to do with trying to immigrate or import just a huge amount of Muslims into the country, but it's simply a huge amount of the poor and the uneducated kind of filling, and I want to say like the lower strata, socioeconomic strata of our society, kind of swelling that unnecessarily. That's a whole separate issue, but regardless, we're not seeing that yet, but we would take this lesson from France, from Sweden, from London to heart if you were to know, hey, look, you cannot import cultures which are anathema to your own within it and expect that this sort of magical commingling to happen. It won't. It simply will not. Following that, you also have the other side of this. If you're looking at this from the Algerian perspective, and you say, look, if you're out there, don't situate yourself into a society which is fundamentally anathema to the way that you want to live your life. Now, the chief difference between the two sides here is when you look at sort of the Algerian or maybe the immigrant position, where you have a fundamentalist worldview, a fundamentalist religious belief system, and you're trying to go someplace else, where you're going someplace else because you perceive some sort of benefit from getting there. So in case for Algerians moving to France, you perceive of France's wealth and capability, and you probably have false notions as to what France or another or Western country can offer, in the same sense that from the U.S.'s perspective, when we look at a lot of individuals who are flooding our southern border, these individuals somewhat incorrectly perceive the fact that they're going to get to the United States and all of a sudden be handed a good life, handed money, handed wealth far greater than what they have in their home country, which under the present administration is largely true. You can come in without few or little any sort of screening, and you'll get hooked up with benefits and welfare packages, and then sent somewhere within the interior of the country, just disappear and never show up for your court date. Again, separate issue. But that is the chief motivation for individuals in the French and Algerian situation. That's why Algerians came to France. They wanted to. They either had correctly or incorrectly perceived their ability to benefit from the French system, the Western moral tradition, from the society that the Western moral tradition birthed. Part of the tension is they got there, and that sort of material wealth has not materialized because it's not there. It's not possible. The French can't sustain a huge influx of individuals on its pretty progressive social welfare system. And so you have what, if you're familiar with it, relative deprivation of increase in livelihood or cost of living or living standards. And now you're seeing tension there, along with the racial and religious elements. So now you're seeing this. So if you're looking at it from the Algerian perspective, do not import yourself or do not situate yourself into a society which is anathema to the way you believe. But again, for us, from an outside perspective, we need to understand that the reason that you see an ultimately barbaric culture immigrating into a Western moral culture is really two reasons. One, there's a perception of benefit to be had. And you might think, oh, well, because I assume we've all come through this, sort of maybe a thought experiment of, call it a would you rather. Hey, would you do X horrible thing to receive Y amount of money? We've all kind of had that thought or had that question posed to us. And at a certain point, there's just certain things that no amount of money will convince you to do. Right? So you might think to yourself, well, if you're a true believer, a true fundamental Muslim, and you're trying to go to a Western society, and you understand that this Western society, at least from your perspective, is gross and evil, well, you might think, why would I go there? There's no amount of money which would encourage me or convince me to plant myself in a society which I believe is ultimately destructive to me or potentially my children? Well, if you understand that you're going to go there with a bunch of different people like yourself and form an enclave and then take over the place or take over sections as you see fit, you could be convinced, right? You could be convinced. So that's largely what's going on here. So here's the wrap up. At present, in year 2023, humans still are ultimately tribal creatures. There are different clumps of civilizations that exist across the world, and for largely those civilizations cannot intermingle, or at least they will not intermingle by some sort of artificial force. It's possible that while keeping two societies wholly separated, one society could experience such a huge amount of success, prosperity, and growth, so as then to convince other societies to adopt elements of that. So as an example, in the modern era, when you look at the American way of life, what we have from the American way of life, since World War II, really, American culture has taken over the globe. Culture is America's chief export. American movies, American television, American music is consumed all across the world. American fashion consumed all across the world. You know, in America, we may view the French or Italians from like a fashion or cultural perspective as neat, but in the rest of the world, it's the reverse. It's American culture that is widely consumed, or is consumed consumed across the world to a greater degree than the reverse, than global media is consumed at home. So when we understand that to be the case, there have been elements of societies across the world which have began to accept and willingly convert to a Western way of thinking, a Western way of behaving. Now, it's certainly not absolute, but that might be possible. And even then, I'm dubious about that. So it's important to understand that there are these civilizations which we will go ahead and clash with. More importantly, as we think about it, and I don't say this with any level of joy, but it is the reality that when we're talking about that's one of those civilizations characterized by Islam, it's important to understand that unfortunately the places in the world where the Islamic culture borders with the Judeo-Christian or others, those borders get pretty violent. And so when you look at who's fighting with whom, there's a reason that something like 90 some odd % of all global terrorism is birthed from Islamic terrorism. I get it. Everyone's like hashtag not all Muslims. I get it. And for those of you out there who are being peaceable, I appreciate that. But it doesn't change the fact that when you're dealing with societies from, generally speaking, from the Mideast of Islamic origin, you're dealing with societies that are fundamentally anathema to those in the West. Now you can be mad. It just is at this time. I'm not saying it's unchangeable. I'm not saying it's immutable. I'm not saying that at some point something could happen which would either cause the human race itself to come together, like aliens come down or whatnot. That might be possible. Might also be possible that something happens within the Arabic and Muslim world to cause them to revolutionize the religious component and modernize to the point where they can interact with the rest of the world in a more peaceable manner. We've seen glimmers of that hope. We kind of saw Iran in the 1970s. I just referenced the historical components of some of the Muslim empires from back in the day, so it's not impossible. It just seems very improbable at this time. So I hope that it changes. I wouldn't mind that one bit, but presently that's not the case. And you would, as a country and as a people, you would import these cultures into your own at your own peril. So if you happen to be listening to it, consider this when you go to the voting booth, and you're trying to pick representatives. What are they saying about immigration? It's important. And again, as is my typical caveat, so I can get ahead of this whole, Dan, you're just a white guy and you're racist and you hate Muslims and whatnot. Firstly, Muslim is not an ethnicity or a race. It's a religious belief. Secondly, yeah, I don't care. I just don't care. I care a lot more about what somebody believes as opposed to what they look like. So as a result, if you show me somebody who is a devout Christian, for example, or even an atheist or a secularist who is compatible with the Western moral tradition, I really don't care what their skin color is. I just don't. You even show me a group of Muslims per se that are moderate, okay, and moderate, and they have some sort of answer for the conflicts, the intellectual conflicts within the own religion, okay. Like, I'm willing to accept that. I just haven't seen it yet. Show it to me. I'm happy to take a look. I'm happy to be wrong. I would love to be wrong. I would love to sit by a campfire and sing Kumbaya with all the peoples of the world. That would be great. But unfortunately, life doesn't work that way presently. So that's what I'll leave you with. When you look at France, man, the thing is on fire. France should serve as a great lesson to the rest of the world, the rest of the West in particular. Please stop importing cultures which are anathema to your own. Even if there are even majority good eggs in the cultures that you are trying to import, if a small percentage, which then still constitutes thousands of individuals, are going to create a very serious problem for your country, it doesn't take too many to really create a problem. Keep in mind, again, for an American audience, the American Revolution was really carried out by about 10% of the total population at the time. Most people in America were just chilling, doing their own thing. Maybe some people supported, some people were against it, but the people who were fighting, about 10% of the population. It doesn't take too many people to actually affect great change in a country. So you will import radicals at your own peril. So if you have a cultural group and you're thinking to yourself, these individuals have an X% chance of being fundamentalist radicals, unfortunately, you might have to just be like, okay, look, I'm not going to risk it. I'm not going to risk it. That sounds mean, but hey, by the same time, think about it realistically. Let's imagine for a moment that you were, let's say you ran like a multi-unit condo, that you're going to rent out some of the units that you still live there. You lived there, you're the landlord there, and you're going to rent that out. And you have several applicants, and you have one applicant who is basically like you. At least they believe the same way as you. They're clean, they're orderly, they go to work, they come home, they're relatively peaceable. They maybe have their friends over from time to time, but they're not raucous or rowdy. Then conversely, you have another applicant who's who's quite literally shows up to chat with you for the renter's interview in like an era accurate Nazi uniform, who you let live with you. You're going to go with the person who's like you. And that's an extraordinary, extreme example. But keep the thought process in mind. If you've got somebody who basically shares the same schedule, same beliefs, same lifestyle that you do, you're far more likely, in a sense, like if you're going to rent out a room in your house, you're far more likely going to sign that person up. And you are going to immediately cross off the individuals who don't appear to share your values when it comes to a shared living space, delegation of duties, things like that. So, sounds mean, but it isn't ultimately. And quite frankly, it's better off. A lot of times these cultures come into the United States with this belief that, not in the United States, come into the West with this belief that life is going to be a certain way, and it's not. And they often then experience a great deal of tension that they probably wouldn't have otherwise had they just stayed home, right? This is the case in France. This is the case in Sweden. This is the case here in the United States, but not with Muslim immigrants, but rather just immigrants from Latin America. A lot of times these individuals come in thinking life's going to be wonderful, and it's just not, because they just believe erroneous things when it comes to a Western economy, what it can support. So it's for the best. These individuals will be far better off in their own culture, in their own home, in their native lands, doing their thing. And so it's best that we don't do that, or at least think really hard or be very scrupulous if we're going to. So that's what I'll leave with, folks. My name has been Dan Weichart with Weichart Media. Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this particular clip, please give me a thumbs up here on Rumble. Give me a like and a subscribe. Comment, if you will, on YouTube later on down the road once this goes up there if it doesn't get taken down, because it's kind of a hot button topic. You can find me on virtually all social media at Weichart Media, and I look forward to seeing you. We'll talk to you later.